The clock read 8:42 a.m. as Kendrick Robinson pulled into the courthouse parking lot in Greenville, South Carolina. The sun, still soft in the morning sky, stretched long shadows across the pavement. Kendrick, already tense, let out a slow breath. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, punctuality and discipline were at the core of his work ethic. But today, everything seemed off. It was supposed to be a straightforward morning, a simple challenge regarding an unjust property tax hike on the house his grandmother had left him. But life had other plans. The house wasn't just property, it was his past, his memories. He had spent years making sure it was protected. Every corner of it held a lesson from his grandmother, shaping the person he had become. She had taught him what was right and wrong, and it felt like a betrayal to see this institution threaten the place that held so much of his life. Kendrick had spent weeks compiling evidence to prove the tax hike was an error. He could never back down from a challenge, especially when it came to something this personal. Dressed in a sharp navy suit and crisp white shirt, Kendrick looked the part of the seasoned prosecutor he was, even if his morning had been less than smooth. A phone call about an urgent human trafficking case had derailed his timing. The defense team had filed an emergency motion, and as much as he had tried to focus on his personal case, he couldn't ignore the responsibility of his ongoing work. The motion was crucial, so after reviewing it and briefing his team, he rushed to the courthouse, knowing time was running out. As he neared the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. It was a quick message from his assistant. The judge in Greenville has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful. Kendrick sighed and tucked his phone into his briefcase. He wasn't worried. He knew the facts would win the day. But the message stuck with him, a reminder that the stakes were always high. Entering the courthouse, Kendrick was immediately struck by the difference between this municipal court and the federal courts he usually frequented. The walls, a faded beige, held the weight of time, decades of scuffed seats and worn floors. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and stale coffee. The space buzzed with activity, but it was all trivial: disputes over parking tickets, minor cases, things that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Kendrick checked his watch. 8:50 a.m. He had 10 minutes to find the right courtroom. He moved quickly down the hallway, past murmured conversations, before finding room 204. The name, Judge Charles Whitman, was etched in brass on the door. Kendrick straightened his tie and entered. Inside, the courtroom was already filling up. He found a spot at the back, flipping open his file to review his evidence one more time. His heart raced slightly, but he forced himself to focus. A figure in the doorway caught his attention. Judge Charles Whitman, tall, with a silver mane and piercing blue eyes, entered the room exuding authority. Without a word, the judge commanded attention, his gaze sharp and calculating. Kendrick knew he had a reputation. Whitman had earned it. The air seemed to stiffen in his presence, and for a moment everything else in the room faded. All rise. The bailiff's voice broke the silence, and everyone stood as the judge settled into his chair. Whitman's eyes scanned the room methodically, missing nothing. As he began calling cases, his voice was detached, mechanical, as if the world had long ceased to surprise him. Kendrick's case was up next, but the wait felt like an eternity. Kendrick straightened, determined to make his case, knowing that every detail mattered. This wasn't just about the taxes. It was about standing up for what was right, for honoring his grandmother's memory. But with each passing case, Kendrick's focus shifted. He noticed the undercurrent of tension in the room. People were here for their own battles too, just trying to make it through another day, facing down systems that often ignored them. Some were black, others not, but the weight of the courtroom felt universal. Every face held a story of struggle, even if they weren't all visible. Finally, it was Kendrick's turn. As he stood up, his mind flashed back to the day he had inherited the house. The lessons, the warmth, the wisdom. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, but it didn't faze him. This was his moment, his time to stand strong for justice, for his heritage, for the fight against an unfair system. Kendrick shuffled in quietly, slipping into the courtroom unnoticed. Moments later, a young woman dressed in casual clothes entered, as well, taking a seat without so much as a glance from the judge. Both were late, but neither received the usual reprimand. Kendrick made a mental note of it, but focused on his own case. As the minutes ticked by, the weight of the courtroom seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. At precisely 9:15 a.m., Kendrick's name rang out, cutting through the hum of the courtroom. He gathered his folder, straightened his tie, and approached the podium. Despite the slight delay, he projected a calm confidence, his posture straight, his steps deliberate. But as he neared the judge's bench, Kendrick noticed the change in the room. Judge Whitman, who had been indifferent to the others, looked up with a steely gaze, his expression hardening at the sight of Kendrick. "You're late, Mr. Robinson." Judge Whitman's voice sliced through the room, sharp and unforgiving. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Kendrick raised his hand slightly, palms open in a gesture of acknowledgement. His voice steady as he replied, "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters." But the judge was already cutting him off, his tone even more severe. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities." The weight of dozens of eyes bore down on Kendrick, but he didn't falter. His gaze stayed steady, his words calculated. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment." Judge Whitman dismissed him with a wave of his hand. "We'll get to that. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $750. The words hit with the force of an anvil striking metal. Kendrick's jaw tightened, but his face remained composed. The murmurs around him rose in a soft crescendo, but Kendrick kept his focus. He had expected challenges, but this was something else entirely. "Your Honor," Kendrick began again, his tone unwavering. "May I explain?" The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, silencing Kendrick immediately. "You may not. Consider this a lesson in respecting the court." Kendrick stepped back, the sting of the fine settling in. But his mind wasn't on the money. It was on something deeper, something that many in the room had likely seen before. He glanced briefly at the others who had arrived late, none of whom had been reprimanded. The disparity was glaring. He wasn't going to let this moment pass without scrutiny. As he returned to his seat, Kendrick opened his folder. But it wasn't the property tax documents he focused on this time. His pen moved swiftly, scribbling down observations and notes. He could feel the judge moving on to the next case, his voice unaffected by the storm brewing in Kendrick's mind. This wasn't just about a fine. Kendrick knew that. It was something systemic, a pattern he could recognize in an instant. The fine was steep, too steep for a mere tardiness in municipal court. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was punitive, a lesson in power and control. Around him, Kendrick could sense the mix of disbelief and discomfort from those present. The eyes of the room seemed to follow his every move, the quiet buzz of whispered speculation filling the air. People were thinking the same thing. How had this been allowed to happen? But no one spoke up. No one dared to challenge the authority of the judge. Kendrick sat back, his thoughts racing. He replayed the moment over and over in his mind. The judge's gavel, the fine, the disparity between how he was treated and how others were let off, the hook. The young woman who had slipped in late, absorbed in her phone, hadn't faced a single word of reprimand. The man in the gray blazer, clearly late himself, had received no more than a passing glance. And then there was Kendrick, the only one who'd felt the full weight of Judge Whitman's judgment. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, and Kendrick had seen enough in his career to recognize it. He wasn't just fighting for the house his grandmother had left him anymore. He was fighting for something larger, the right to be treated equally no matter the setting. "Next case," Judge Whitman called out, his voice breaking through Kendrick's thoughts. "Mr. Robinson." The room fell silent, and Kendrick stood, his stride steady and deliberate. He was no longer just a prosecutor defending his property taxes. He was now a man standing up against the subtle injustices that had been lurking beneath the surface of the mundane courtroom. As Kendrick returned to the podium, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Whitman fixed him with the same piercing gaze, as if daring him to falter. Kendrick held his ground, his voice steady as he began. "Your Honor, I have here documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment," Kendrick said, opening his folder and spreading the neatly organized documents and photographs before the judge. "The property has been in my family for decades, and these adjustments do not align with the city's assessed values." He pointed to a specific page, his finger tracing the lines of evidence. "This shows the original tax assessment, which remained consistent for 5 years. The new adjustment, however, reflects a 30% increase without proper notification or explanation." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of disinterest. "I'll review it in due time, Mr. Robinson. However, your tardiness this morning is a matter we cannot overlook." Kendrick's composure remained unshaken. "Your Honor, I mean no disrespect. My delay was due to a federal case involving human trafficking, a matter I believe we all agree requires immediate attention." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone didn't soften. "Your priorities, however noble, do not excuse breaking the rules. Court procedures exist for a reason." It wasn't the words themselves that struck Kendrick. It was the unspoken tone of dismissal, the implicit message that his explanation wasn't good enough. His professional achievements, his character, even his genuine effort to respect the system, none of it mattered in this room. Kendrick's jaw tightened, but he took a slow breath, letting the moment settle. He had to be careful with his words now, but he knew the right question to ask. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of rules," Kendrick began. "However, I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom?" A ripple of unease passed through the room, and Kendrick could feel the shift. Judge Whitman stiffened, his color deepening as his gaze sharpened. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Robinson?" Kendrick's tone remained even. "I'm asking for clarity. It's important to ensure that fairness is upheld, not just for myself, but for everyone here." The judge's gavel came down with a resounding crack. "I will not tolerate accusations against this court. Your fine stands." Kendrick inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Your Honor." As he returned to his seat, Kendrick felt the weight of the courtroom's collective gaze. He could sense the quiet admiration from some and the trepidation from others. This wasn't the first time Kendrick had encountered bias cloaked in authority, but something about this moment felt different. The energy in the room had shifted, and it seemed like everyone was now waiting to see what Kendrick would do next. He pulled out his phone, typing notes discreetly. He wasn't done, far from it. The fire in his chest had only grown. This situation wouldn't end here. Kendrick knew that this moment, this injustice, had to be addressed. And he was going to make sure it wasn't swept under the rug. As the courtroom session continued, Kendrick could feel the change in the atmosphere. The usual hum of cases being called and dismissed seemed quieter, more subdued. Others noticed it too. An older black man, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned slightly in his seat. He offered Kendrick a brief, knowing glance, as if acknowledging the unspoken understanding that passed between them. Kendrick didn't return the glance, but he felt the silent support. The weight of history, of shared experiences, lingered in that brief moment. The court clerk, fingers flying over the keyboard, paused occasionally. Kendrick could see the discomfort on her face, her hesitation more apparent now. It was subtle but unmistakable. She had felt it too, the tension, the shifting balance of power in the room. When the session finally ended, Kendrick lingered for a moment, observing the way people filed out. He noticed how some carried themselves differently, more stiffly, as if bearing an unspoken weight from what had transpired. A young law student sitting in the corner of the room, who had been observing the proceedings intently, glanced up at Kendrick. Their eyes met for just a second, and Kendrick saw something flicker in the student's gaze, a mix of curiosity and perhaps a touch of hope. The courtroom may have returned to its routine, but Kendrick had already made his mark. The system had tried to silence him with a fine, with tactics meant to remind him of his place. But Kendrick wasn't backing down. Not today. Kendrick walked out of the courtroom, briefcase in hand, his mind racing. The usual sounds of the courthouse seemed muted as he stepped into the crisp air outside. He took a deep breath, but the tension still clung to him, a heavy weight he couldn't shake. This was no longer just about a property tax dispute or the fine he'd been slapped with. The real issue was far larger, something Kendrick knew he couldn't ignore. As he stood on the courthouse steps, staring at his phone, his thumb hovered over the contact for his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's office. He was close to calling, but something stopped him. Not yet. His instincts told him there was more to this than a quick resolution. He needed to think. Opening his briefcase, Kendrick pulled out his badge and credentials, the emblem gleaming in the sunlight. The weight of the federal prosecutor's badge, embossed in gold, felt more significant than ever. This wasn't just about his personal experience in the courtroom. It was about a system that Kendrick had seen show cracks before, but now revealed something even deeper. A pattern, a structure, a history of inequality that couldn't be ignored. He knew with certainty that what he'd witnessed in Judge Whitman's courtroom was no accident. The disparate treatment of latecomers wasn't incidental. It was part of a larger problem, a problem that went beyond taxes, beyond a simple fine. Kendrick now had the pieces of a much bigger case, one that needed to be addressed. Back in his car, Kendrick opened his briefcase again, reviewing his notes. The decision he had made solidified in his mind. He wasn't done. He had to return to the courtroom. He had to take the next step. By the time Kendrick re-entered the courthouse, most of the morning's cases had concluded. The room was quieter. Now, with only a few stragglers flipping through papers or waiting for their turn. Judge Whitman was leafing through some documents, his demeanor calm but visibly weary. Kendrick's presence in the room seemed to shift the air. He walked toward the bench with confidence, his badge and identification in hand, knowing that what he was about to do would shake the room. As he approached the podium, the court clerk raised her eyes from her keyboard, her fingers pausing mid-type. Judge Whitman glanced up, his irritation returning almost immediately. "Mr. Robinson, the court session has concluded. If you have further business, you'll need to schedule an appointment," he said curtly. Kendrick held his ground, his voice calm but filled with quiet authority. "With respect, Your Honor," he began, making sure everyone in the room could hear. "I believe it's important to formally introduce myself." He held up his badge slightly, ensuring it was visible. "I'm Kendrick Robinson, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've been with the Department of Justice for over a decade, focusing on cases involving human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations." Judge Whitman froze. His hands stilled over the papers he had been handling, and the color drained from his face. Kendrick could feel the shift in the room. The remaining spectators, those few left, watched with intense curiosity, some with anticipation, others with wariness. I was late this morning because of an urgent federal case requiring my immediate attention, Kendrick continued, his tone firm but respectful. And while I understand the importance of court procedures, I couldn't help but notice the disparity in how cases were handled here today. The judge's lips pressed into a thin, tight line. Mr. Robinson, he said, his voice tight, if you feel there was a procedural issue, you're welcome to file a formal complaint. Kendrick didn't flinch. I've already begun documenting the events of this morning, he replied, holding up his notebook. Not just my own treatment, but the differing responses to other latecomers, particularly along racial lines. A hush fell over the room. As an officer of the court, Kendrick continued, his gaze never leaving the judges, I am obligated to report any patterns of bias or discrimination I encounter. What I witnessed today raises serious concerns. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, clearly uneasy, his earlier bravado faltering. Are you accusing this court of misconduct, Mr. Robinson? Kendrick met the judge's gaze squarely, his voice unwavering. I'm stating what I observed, Your Honor. As a federal prosecutor, I've dedicated my career to ensuring justice is applied equally, regardless of who stands before the bench. And what I saw today raises significant questions about the integrity of these proceedings. The silence in the room was deafening. Even the court clerk, who had been furiously typing just moments before, paused, her eyes darting nervously between Kendrick and the judge. Her hands hovered uncertainly over the keyboard, unsure of what would come next. In the back corner of the room, the young law student who had been watching Kendrick intently, scribbling furiously in their notebook, paused. Their eyes were wide, with awe and determination, recognizing the weight of what was unfolding. The power dynamics of the courtroom had shifted, and Kendrick had made it clear. He would no longer let the system operate without scrutiny. The judge cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the room. This court takes such matters seriously, he said, his voice attempting to steady itself. If you believe there was an error in judgment, I suggest addressing it through the appropriate channels. Kendrick placed his badge and identification on the podium, ensuring it was visible to everyone in the room. His voice was calm, but resolute. I intend to, Your Honor. But I also believe this moment presents an opportunity for reflection on how we ensure that the principles of fairness and equality are upheld in every courtroom. Judge Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair. The authority he had wielded for decades suddenly felt less solid. For the first time in his long career, his confidence faltered, and Kendrick could sense it. The judge, rarely challenged, clearly wasn't prepared for someone like Kendrick to speak up with such directness. You may go, Mr. Robinson, the judge said, his voice quieter now, laced with a tone Kendrick had never heard from him before. Kendrick gathered his credentials, and as he turned to leave, he offered one final statement. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll ensure this is addressed properly. As Kendrick walked out of the courtroom for the second time that morning, he could feel the eyes of every remaining spectator on his back. The weight of the moment settled over him, its significance not lost on him. This wasn't just about standing up for himself, it was about challenging a system that had been blind to its own flaws for far too long. Once outside, Kendrick immediately pulled out his phone and began typing a detailed email to his office. He wrote down every observation, every interaction, and every instance of disparity he had witnessed. By the time he hit send, he knew this was only the beginning. He was committed now. This wasn't just about one judge. It was about a larger, systemic issue and he was determined to see it through. The next morning, Kendrick's phone buzzed with a call from his supervisor, Julia Harper, a no-nonsense attorney with decades of experience. The urgency in her voice was evident as she spoke, her words mixed with both curiosity and a sense of impending responsibility. "Kendrick, I read your report," she said, her voice firm. "If what you're describing is accurate, it's not just a one-off situation. This could indicate systemic bias." "I believe it does," Kendrick replied without hesitation. "What happened yesterday wasn't subtle. It's part of a pattern I've seen before, and I'm certain I'm not the only one who's experienced it." Julia exhaled sharply, processing the gravity of the situation. "I'll reach out to the Judicial Review Commission," she said. "This needs to be handled delicately but thoroughly. In the meantime, gather as much documentation as you can. If this goes public, we need to be ready." The call ended, but Kendrick's work was just beginning. Over the following days, Kendrick immersed himself in the investigation. He combed through every detail of the municipal court session. His mind worked meticulously, connecting the dots and finding patterns where there had been injustice. He began poring over public records, digging into inconsistencies in fines and penalties issued by Judge Whitman. It didn't take long before patterns began to emerge, disturbing ones. Fines for minor infractions were significantly higher for black defendants, while white defendants often received warnings or reduced penalties. It was as if the law itself was being selectively applied, depending on who stood before the judge. Kendrick knew he wasn't imagining it. He had seen it firsthand, and now he had the documentation to prove it. Kendrick reached out to his colleagues and community members, including attorneys who had appeared in Judge Whitman's courtroom. The responses were overwhelming. Stories of disparate treatment poured in, some whispered in confidence, others shared with bold defiance. A young black woman recounted being fined heavily for a parking violation, while a white man with multiple offenses received only a small fee. Another person described how the judge often interrupted black defendants, rarely allowing them to fully explain their cases. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systemic issue, and Kendrick was compiling the evidence. Within days, the Judicial Review Commission had initiated a formal inquiry. Investigators arrived at the courthouse, requesting years' worth of case records and interviewing staff. The atmosphere was tense, and those who had been in the courtroom were beginning to feel the ripple effects of Kendrick's actions. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, proved to be a pivotal figure. Nervously, she handed over a small notebook she had kept hidden in her desk drawer for years. "These are notes I've been taking," she confessed, her voice low. "Every time something didn't sit right, I wrote it down. I've been too afraid to say anything, but I can't ignore it anymore." The notes were damning, each entry meticulously recorded with dates, names, and instances of unequal treatment. It was all there, and it painted a clear and damning picture of systemic bias. Mrs. Thompson had seen it, and now she was stepping forward. Investigators also spoke with James Wilson, the longtime bailiff in the courtroom. His voice was quiet, but filled with quiet conviction as he shared his observations. "I've been here for 15 years, he said. "I've seen how the judge treats people differently, depending on who they are." It was clear now. What Kendrick had witnessed, what he had experienced in that courtroom, wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger systemic problem, and with the support of those who had seen it firsthand, Kendrick was beginning to uncover the truth. "I always knew it wasn't right," James Wilson, the longtime bailiff, said quietly. "But I didn't think there was anything I could do." His words echoed in Kendrick's mind as the investigation deepened. The system had worked for so long with these disparities hidden in plain sight. Now that they were coming to light, they couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, the story began to leak into the local community. A young law student who had witnessed Kendrick's exchange in the courtroom posted a detailed account on social media. Within hours, it went viral, sparking outrage and a flood of similar testimonies from people who had experienced or observed similar biases. The hashtag began trending, and a wave of public support for Kendrick's actions surged. The next thing Kendrick knew, the headlines followed, news outlets picked up the story, and Kendrick found himself at the center of a growing storm. Reporters flooded his phone with non-stop calls, seeking interviews and statements, but Kendrick chose to remain focused on the investigation, undeterred by the media frenzy. He knew the real work was in the evidence, solid, irrefutable proof that Judge Whitman's courtroom had become a bastion of inequality. The mounting pressure began to take its toll on Judge Whitman. Rumors circulated that he had been summoned to multiple closed-door meetings with judicial oversight committees, though he publicly denied any wrongdoing. Privately, he began to realize the gravity of the situation. The walls were closing in, and no amount of denial or avoidance could stop the truth from coming out. By the end of the first week, Kendrick received a call from Julia Harper. "The findings so far are staggering," she said, her voice a mixture of urgency and disbelief. "The numbers don't lie, Kendrick. Black defendants in his courtroom were fined 3 times more often than white defendants for the same infractions. It's systemic." Kendrick had suspected as much, but hearing the confirmation made the weight of the situation sink deeper. "What's the next step?" he asked, his mind already working ahead. "We're taking this to the state judicial board. And, Kendrick, the media isn't going to let this go. Be prepared." Kendrick nodded to himself, even as a wave of exhaustion hit him. This was bigger than he had imagined, but he had no intention of backing down. The stakes had been raised, and he was ready to see it through. By the end of the second week, the story of Kendrick's encounter with Judge Whitman had spread far beyond Greenville. National media outlets began to pick up the case, with headlines like dominating the news cycle. Social media buzzed with the hashtags trending for days as thousands of people shared their own experiences of courtroom discrimination. Kendrick didn't allow himself to be distracted by the growing spectacle around him. He remained focused, working with the Judicial Review Commission to consolidate evidence. The findings, however, were devastating. Over the past 5 years, Judge Whitman had fined black defendants an average of 300% more than white defendants for similar offenses. Late arrivals from white defendants often went unmentioned, while black defendants faced reprimands or steep fines. Requests for leniency, such as payment plans, were disproportionately denied to minority defendants. The evidence wasn't just statistical, it was deeply human. Former defendants came forward, some publicly, others anonymously, to share their harrowing stories. One black mother recalled being fined $500 for contesting a minor zoning issue, despite presenting clear evidence that the city was at fault. A young man shared how the judge had humiliated him in court, questioning his work ethic, only to dismiss a similar case from a white defendant minutes later. These stories began to stack up one after another, creating an irrefutable narrative of a system that had, for far too long, turned a blind eye to its biases. Local activist groups, seeing the momentum building, joined the fray. They organized rallies and protests outside the Greenville courthouse, calling for accountability. Signs reading flooded the streets. It was a movement born from the truth Kendrick had uncovered, and the community rallied around it with unwavering support. Kendrick, though committed to the investigation, did his best to avoid the public spectacle. He didn't need the spotlight. He needed to see justice served. But even he couldn't ignore the significance of what was unfolding within the courthouse walls. The pressure was mounting, and Judge Whitman's grip on his power was slipping. Staff members who had worked under Judge Whitman for years began to share their own observations. They spoke of inconsistencies they had long ignored, moments they had quietly witnessed but never dared to confront. The more Kendrick delved into the details, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a pattern, a clear and deliberate practice of unequal treatment based on race. James Wilson, the bailiff, was one of the first to step forward, his voice heavy with the weight of years of silence. "I've seen how the judge treats people, differently depending on who they are," he said. "But I didn't think anyone would believe me." Kendrick knew now that the time for silence had passed. He wasn't the only one who had seen it. The court staff, the defendants, the community, everyone who had been impacted by Whitman's actions was now coming forward. It was clear. The system had allowed this to continue unchecked, and it was time for accountability. As the weeks passed, the public pressure on Judge Whitman grew, but Kendrick remained focused. The evidence was mounting, and his resolve was unwavering. He knew this fight wasn't just about one judge. It was about challenging the system and demanding that justice truly be blind for everyone who entered a courtroom. The changes inside the Greenville courthouse were undeniable. Mrs. Thompson, the longtime court clerk, had become a key figure in the investigation. Her detailed notes, meticulously kept over the years, were a treasure trove of evidence that, when combined with court records, painted a comprehensive picture of the bias that had plagued the system for decades. "I never thought anyone would listen," she admitted during one interview with investigators, her voice shaky but resolute. "But now that it's all coming out, I can't stay silent anymore." James Wilson, the bailiff, also stepped forward, publicly addressing the commission. "I've seen this kind of treatment for years. It's wrong, and it's long past time for something to be done," he said in a statement that resonated deeply with those who had remained silent for far too long. His words, alongside the testimonies of countless other witnesses, solidified the case against Judge Whitman and exposed the flaws in a system that had turned a blind eye to the inequality it perpetuated. Meanwhile, Judge Whitman found himself increasingly isolated. While he initially dismissed the accusations as misunderstandings or misinterpretations, the mounting evidence forced him into damage control mode. In a rare public statement, he expressed regret for any unintentional actions that may have caused harm. But those words, cold and carefully crafted, rang hollow in the face of overwhelming proof that his actions had been far from unintentional. Kendrick, inundated with media attention, kept his focus where it belonged, on his work as a federal prosecutor. He understood that his responsibilities extended far beyond this single case, and he refused to let the chaos surrounding the investigation derail his broader goals. Still, he couldn't ignore the flood of messages pouring into his office. Emails, phone calls, and letters came from all across the country, some offering support, others sharing similar stories of bias in other courtrooms. One particularly moving letter came from a retired attorney in Alabama. "For years, I saw the same injustices you're describing, but I never spoke up. Thank you for having the courage to do what so many of us couldn't." The movement Kendrick had sparked grew beyond Greenville's borders. Other judges in South Carolina began facing scrutiny as activists and reporters dug into court records, exposing similar patterns of bias and discrimination. The state's Judicial Oversight Committee responded by announcing a broad review of municipal courts, vowing to root out systemic bias wherever it existed. The reverberations were felt far and wide. What had begun as a personal battle for Kendrick had become a clarion call for justice across the state. Systemic reforms were already underway. All court personnel were now required to attend bias training, led by experts who tackled the subtle ways discrimination could seep into decision-making. Kendrick stood at the back of the newly renovated courtroom, his eyes scanning the room. He had been invited to speak to a group of local judges and lawyers about the changes that had been implemented. As he waited for his turn, he felt a mixture of pride and cautious optimism. Change had begun, but he knew there was still a long road ahead. The reforms extended far beyond Greenville. Inspired by Kendrick's actions, other communities in South Carolina and eventually across the country began re-evaluating their own court systems. State judicial review boards implemented mandatory audits of case outcomes with particular attention to racial and socio-economic disparities. Oversight committees composed of legal experts, community advocates, and former defendants were established to monitor court proceedings and ensure accountability. In Kendrick's office, the momentum was palpable. His fine from that fateful morning now hung framed on his wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of why he had taken a stand. Below it was a photo from a recent event, a group of young law students who had started a civil rights clinic in his honor. Their smiles radiated hope, and Kendrick couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility toward the next generation of legal minds in the community. The ripple effects were equally significant. James Wilson, the veteran bailiff who had served under Judge Whitman, was now leading bias training sessions for court officers. At one of his sessions, he addressed a room filled with new hires. "Our job isn't just to keep order," he said. "It's to ensure that everyone who steps into this room is treated with dignity. If you see something wrong, you speak up. Silence is complicity." Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk whose records had been instrumental in the investigation, had been promoted to oversee a new program focused on ethical court practices. She worked tirelessly mentoring younger clerks and ensuring that the mistakes of the past wouldn't repeat themselves. Kendrick's influence extended beyond the legal community. He began teaching a seminar at a nearby law school focusing on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary. His students, many of whom were inspired by his story, often stayed after class to ask how they could make a difference. One afternoon, a student approached him with a notebook filled with ideas for reform. "What do you think is the most important thing we can do to make the system fairer?" she asked. Kendrick thought for a moment before responding. "Listen to each other. To the people who come through our courts and to those who are too afraid to speak up. Listening is where real change begins." The changes weren't without resistance. Some judges and attorneys bristled at the new oversight measures, claiming they undermined their authority. But the evidence was undeniable. Within a year, the data showed a significant decrease in racial disparities in fines and sentences in Greenville's municipal court. Payment plans were approved more often, and defendants reported feeling treated with more respect. For Kendrick, the most rewarding moments came from the people who approached him to share their stories. An elderly black man who had been in the courtroom that morning months ago returned to the courthouse to thank him. "I've been coming here for 40 years, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen so much injustice, but I never thought I'd see the day when someone finally said enough. Thank you for giving us hope." One morning, Kendrick received a letter in his office. It was from a young public defender in Chicago who had read about his story and been inspired to start her own investigation into biases in her local courts. The letter ended with a simple but powerful line. "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Kendrick read the letter twice before placing it in a folder labeled Impact. He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the moment settle. It wasn't about him. It never had been. This was about the countless voices that had been silenced or ignored for too long, voices that were finally being heard. Months later, Kendrick walked back into the courthouse where it had all begun. He wasn't there for a case or an investigation. He had been invited to speak at the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center, named in part after his efforts. As he stepped to the podium, he looked out at the crowd. Judges, lawyers, clerks, and community members filled the room, their faces a mix of anticipation and gratitude. "Justice isn't just about laws," Kendrick began. "It's about how we treat the people who come into our courtrooms. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. And it's about ensuring that every person, no matter who they are, knows that they matter." The applause was thunderous. but Kendrick's focus was on the faces in the crowd. He saw hope, determination, and the beginnings of real change. And he knew that while the work was far from over, this was a step in the right